also very much a cross-cutting issue of migration. All these elements are also captured in our Paris alignment approach that was approved by the end of last year. And de facto, we just realized that this, I would say, our approach was never officially launched because it was basically just after the COP last year. So basically, this is quite a moment for us, basically, to I would say, to share our commitments here to the climate community at this COP. And what our commitments are very much is about to support social investment, but that social investment needs to be aligned with the principles and the goals of the Paris Agreement. We take always into account, if we do projects that are related to climate or social projects, the social dimensions of climate change. And we also always foster social inclusion and resilience. And resilience, of course, can be communities, but it can also be resilience for climate change as well. So that's how the things are connected. Specifically, we were addressed on our focusing, have a specific focus on just an inclusive transition. One of the things that we started with at the beginning of this year is basically implementing the MDB methodologies, the definitions of MDBs, the approaches. And we have started, and Lorenzo is on the floor as well. Basically, we started in tracking our projects in terms, are they Paris aligned? And we have committed to have all our direct finance projects being Paris aligned by the start of 2023. And we also commit to have all our projects being Paris aligned and following the principles by 2024. Of course, these principles are very much determined what, I would say, the outside world is telling us what is Paris aligned. And in that respect, it is, I would say, we really make use of the outcomes of the Joint-MDB group, what has been developed in terms of tracking climate finance, in terms of what are the types of activities that can be qualified as climate finance or not, what are, I would say, concept definitions like lock-in, resilience, etc., etc. And as a smaller MDB, a small to medium-sized MDB, we benefit a lot of this work being done by the Joint-MDB group. And therefore, the discussion that we will have later today is typically an example of the type of discussion where we benefit a lot from. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on definitions, on climate finance, on different types of financial instruments, and how they work out also in the climate finance area. So I'm looking forward, and thank you again to give me the opportunity to make some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Carol. And small is beautiful, you know, they say. So we're all very happy to have CEB in the MDB joint pavilion and in the MDB joint work that we do. And it's great to hear that you have had that commitment. And glad that you've been able to announce it at a COP, even if it was, you know, quite a long time to wait for the COP to make the announcement. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Nancy Sach. I'm the European Investment Bank's Chief Climate Change Expert. I also have the privilege to chair the Joint-MDB reporting group. And I'm just going to take 5 minutes to show you a few things in our climate finance report that was published in October. And I'm not going to particularly be highlighting the numbers. I want to highlight some terminology and some granularity of the reporting that we do. And then we're going to be moving on to this interesting discussion about, are we all using the same words to mean the same things, or are we actually having conversations where we're talking at cross purposes? So this is our list of wonderful panelists. We'll be coming back to them in a minute. So the highlight of this year's MDB Climate Finance Report was that we had already in 2021 reached the volumes of finance that we had estimated we would reach by 2025 when we made our joint announcement in 2019. And I think that's a fantastic piece of news for the implementation COP. And that includes global climate finance for low and middle income countries, adaptation finance, and importantly, of course, mobilization of private finance. And this year's report is very clear in the split between low and middle income countries and high income country data, but there's also a great deal more granularity. And we cannot actually provide in the report every possible split of data, but we often get requests for particular regions or particular sectors and what have you. In the report, we try to provide as much granularity and breakdown as we think will be useful to most readers, but of course, if you're interested in a particular subset that we haven't put, you can always ask us and we can see if we can provide that to you. You can see the link here if you haven't seen it. I, of course, invite you to go and read the MDB's Joint 2021 Climate Finance Report. One of the first things that the report also does is explain methodologies, which is very important for the discussion we're going to have today. In fact, that was the original purpose of the report, was really to showcase the joint methodologies, what we actually use to come up with the numbers that we then all individually report and put together in the joint report. And of course, a few years ago, it became apparent that we needed to develop a clearer bit of thinking on mobilization, catalyzation, co-finance. I've already used 3 different terms there that people may have different views on. And in fact, Carol was one of the people who was leading that work. It was an example of work that was done by the climate teams in the MDBs that then got taken into the wider discussion about mobilizing and catalyzing finance for all types of investments. But in the report, we try to explain clearly what we mean by the different categories of finance, so that when you look at the tables and you look at the graphics, you understand what is it that the MDBs are counting when they talk about private direct mobilization or private finance mobilization, and what do they mean by co-finance. Then we have breakdowns by different instruments. Again, this is something we introduced a few years ago. We found that it was very relevant to look at what kind of instruments are being used for climate finance. And acknowledging that some MDBs, not everybody, welcome Felicity, we're glad to see you, actually count mitigation and adaptation investments that have co-benefits in mitigation adaptation. They count them as a sort of separate type of finance. And some of the other MDBs, they always split those things across either mitigation or adaptation. So we try and make that clear as well. It all adds up to a good total. However you count it, it should be with the same methodology. This is a different example of the granularity in the report, which is by sector. So this is the mitigation finance by sector. Again, some people are very, very interested to see how that spread is across different types of investments. And here is another example. This is just the adaptation table by region. I'm not saying that we only report this. You'll see there are many tables, but you know, we have regional information. We also have information on least developed countries and small island developing states and many, many other granular sets of data. So having, I guess I should go back to the beginning. That's a bit too early to thank you, as you haven't participated yet. So now I'm going to move to the main structure of the event, and I'd like to invite the panelists from the first panel to come up and join me here. And they are Sonia Dunlop, who is the program lead on public banks and MDBs at E3G. Morgan Richmond, who is senior analyst at the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI. And a very kind last-minute addition, but absolutely very welcome, Jorim Schraven, Director of Impact and ESG at FMO, the Dutch Development Bank. And he is, he's not going to try and replace José Luis Blasco from Acciona, because I think that's an impossible task if you've ever met José Luis. But he was called urgently back to Madrid and is, I think, literally flying out right now, and sent his apologies. And I think that's a shame, because it would have been, I think, interesting to have a corporate. But in FMO, they're very, very much in touch with the private markets, with funds and with investors and pension funds. So I'm hoping that he will bring that angle into his inputs. So this first panel, we're going to be talking about finance terminology. So I'm just going to throw some terms out. Climate finance, green finance, sustainable finance, transition finance, Paris-aligned finance, resilience finance, and maybe, as we've got CPI here, climate-aligned finance. So I'm going to be asking all the panelists the same question. I'm going to start with you, Sonia. Is there any particular climate or climate finance terminology that you find particularly challenging or confusing in your work at E3G? Could you tell us a bit more about that? And you have to, you can pick it up actually if it's too far away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you everyone. So my name's Sonia Dunlop. I'm the program lead for public banks and multilateral development banks at E3G. E3G is a climate change think tank with offices around the world. And we do a lot of work to analyze and research and advocacy work around the various different climate-related work and commitments of the multilateral development banks. And first of all, I just want to say I recognize how hard it is to count and define all of these terms. So you know, it is a very challenging thing. It is also challenging, I can tell you, to scrutinize and monitor the use of these terms. You know, all the MDBs have climate finance targets that are defined in different ways. For example, some defined in terms of green finance, some defined in terms of climate finance, and so it is difficult to compare and contrast across these different terms. You know, in terms, to answer the question, in terms of the terms that I think are particularly challenging for us often, I would pick out sustainable finance, low carbon finance, clean energy finance, because here these are the ones that we find you often have to be particularly careful with. And I think often there is a bit of a tension, and I don't know if others would agree, between the quantity and the quality of finance. And the quality very much comes in terms of how strictly defined that is, whether that's adaptation finance, mitigation finance, or anything else. Whereas there is always also a push from shareholders, and I work a lot with the shareholders, for more quantity, more quantity. But of course that has to be quality and has to be strictly defined, but we also want more quantity, right? And there's that, you know, and sometimes people have to decide which is more important in that tension. We published a website called the E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix, a website where we put analysis of Paris alignment of all the main multilateral development banks and bilateral development finance institutions. We are actually publishing that analysis for AFD, Agence Française de Développement, tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, and we hope to add every single member of the International Development Finance Club over the next few years. But in that, we look specifically at climate finance performance, at definitions, also at much more granular things such as greenhouse gas accounting definitions, shadow carbon prices, and that kind of thing. And using all that analysis, we have also put out some estimates of ours in terms, if you remember that first slide with the bar charts, estimates of our estimates of total MDB climate finance going forwards. So obviously the MDBs have done very well and met their climate finance estimates, their projections for 2025 already. But we at E3G, we reckon, and this is just our guess, that by the time we get to 2025, we will be seeing something between 90 and 108 billion of total MDB climate finance that year, including 56 billion for low and middle income countries and 21 billion to adaptation. And that's our estimate, and people are very welcome to challenge that because I'm sure we haven't got all the right assumptions, but that's our best guess. I just also want to very briefly touch on the area of transition finance, because at E3G, more and more, we think this is the critical area to define and to get the change we need in the global financial system moving. So we have just published a report on EU transition finance, how it should be defined, but also what needs to happen to make sure that it is actually delivered, and what the European Commission and the EU have to do to make sure it is actually delivered. And I'm happy to share that report further because I think that is absolutely critical. And finally, I want to just say we also struggle a lot with the idea of climate co-benefits at some MDBs, just because we're aware that can sometimes be difficult to define and difficult to count internally, and so we really encourage maximum transparency at project level, and I know the shareholders are also pushing for this a lot. Maximum transparency at project level, what has been counted as climate finance, what has been counted as adaptation and mitigation finance, and what are the subcomponents that have been counted in that way, because that is really needed. And finally, publication of Paris alignment methodology is really important to spread all that best practice across the financial system. So just a few opening points from you, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
So this one is a lot louder. Okay. Thank you very much, Sonia. I think some of my pet concerns you've mentioned. I'm just going to, before I go to Morgan, I'm going to answer one very important question. It is true that some MDBs have green targets, or in the case of EIB, because we like to make things really complicated, climate action and environmental sustainability. But the reporting that goes into the Joint-MDB climate finance report is only the climate finance part of that. It doesn't answer all your questions, but I just want to be really clear about that. So now I'm going to ask the same question to CPI. Are there any terminology problems, Morgan, that CPI sees? Are there any particularly troubling or confusing terms that you see as a priority to sort of clarify? Perhaps you could give us some remarks on that from your side. No, you'd have to turn the red off. Yes.
How's it now? Better.
You need
okay.
to be
I'll be
fairly
even closer. Great. Well, thank you. And I'm sort of echoing both Nancy and Sonia. I think my background is in adaptation and resilience. That's most of what I work on at CPI, and including our adaptation finance tracking work. So just echoing your feeling that there are many terms, and preparing even for this panel, I was working with our larger CPI team to think through all the terms and sort of make sure that I was coming to this panel with the right definitions. And it was a challenge. So echoing your sort of opening thoughts. Maybe to offer some context first on the work that CPI does that I think is relevant to this terminology discussion, I'll flag two projects that we work on. One is the global landscape of climate finance, the most comprehensive analysis of primary investment flows into climate finance. And then the second is analysis that we did last year and that is carrying on private financial institutions' Paris alignment commitments. So I'll talk first about some context about terminology based on the global landscape, and then I'll move to the Paris alignment discussion. On the global landscape, I would say, as the name sounds, global landscape of climate finance, the terminology that we're using most, exactly as Nancy said, for the MDBs is climate finance. So that's what is being tracked in the global landscape. It's tracked against the standard definition from the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance, reduction in emissions and building resilience, primary flows to the real economy for those activities. So that's climate finance. We also do some tracking of green finance outside of the global landscape context, of tracking of green finance in India. So the definition being both climate finance and broader environmental initiatives that are not directly reducing emissions or building resilience, but have other environmental impacts. So green finance in that context. And then on the note about climate-aligned finance, thank you for raising it. You're benefiting my having done my homework and asking our team that works on it. How I understand the difference is that climate finance is a portion of climate-aligned finance. So primary investment flows into climate solutions is the climate finance piece. But then climate-aligned finance is a broader ecosystem of alignment with portfolios and integration and targets. So it's finance towards the larger Paris alignment ecosystem, or alignment, climate alignment ecosystem. So that's sort of how we think about the two. In some ways, like a square and a rectangle situation, if that's useful. Then. In terms of challenges, to actually get to your question, Nancy, the two that I'll flag briefly are maybe not a challenge and an opportunity is in adaptation and resilience. I think we often see those terms used more or less interchangeably, adaptation finance and resilience finance. What we're tracking in the global landscape and what we see mostly in tracking of climate finance is adaptation finance tracking, and I think that's the right approach going forward. Seeing the distinction as adaptation being, in some ways, the verb, the action of adapting to changing climate conditions, and resilience as sort of the adjective or adverb in terms of form of speech, the outcome, the built resilience, the capacity at the end of the adaptation to respond to changing climate conditions. So we're tracking adaptation finance. The challenge that I see, among others, in terms both sort of the use of both interchangeably, but also that I think, for example, if you invest X dollars in a cooling center or a seawall or adaptation technology, that X dollars would be counted likely as adaptation finance, whereas if you invested the same X dollars in hardening of a flood hardening of a wastewater treatment plant, that investment could be adaptation, but then I think the question I'm interested in having a conversation about this is what to do about the finance in the wastewater treatment plant that is potentially now more systemically resilient. So as we continue these discussions about systemic resilience, which I think is great, thinking about how do we track incremental adaptation and systemic resilience, I think I know that discussion is happening, and I think it's super worthwhile. So that's that. Final thing on Paris alignment, very briefly, another challenge that we see and saw in the tracking of private financial institutions' commitments was in the interchangeable use of net zero and Paris alignment, and in missing interim targets in reporting on net zero as Paris alignment. So institutions sort of using the words Paris alignment, but really only talking about shorter term net zero commitments or not having interim targets. So that's the last piece. I'm happy to continue the discussion.
So thank you very much. I think if we do have Barbara here at the end, I might ask her, what's the difference still? I'm still not clear of the difference between climate aligned and Paris aligned, but maybe we can have a coffee over that at some point. But I think your concern about clarifying adaptation and resilience and how do we address some of these complicated middle areas is very important. And on that note, as this is the Joint-MDB Pavilion, I'm going to tell you that tomorrow there is another Joint-MDB event at 1 o'clock, the same time here, where we will be presenting the update of our adaptation finance tracking methodology, but also, which I think might answer some of your questions, but also explaining what we're doing more widely on adaptation. So please come along at 1 o'clock tomorrow. So now I'm delighted to hand over to Jorim Schraven from FMO. Jorim, either from the aspect of FMO or from the investors that you have conversations with, what are the challenging terms or the things where you think there's the biggest confusion, or where you think there should be work done that we kind of come to some agreement in these finance terms?
Thank you, Nancy. So I'm the Director Impact and ESG at FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, and we're very active, of course, in this space. You had a lovely and rather lengthy list, I think, of options, and frankly, I think they're all very deserving of further work and further clarification. So what I'll do is maybe I'll dive into one or two, and just to land a couple of points to illustrate the type of challenges. So maybe I can pick up where you left off, which is really on Paris aligned, which I think is a very important one that we must all kind of clarify at various levels. First clarification is, when we say Paris aligned, what do we even mean? Are we talking about the institution making the claim as an institution, or are we talking about the individual projects that institution is financing? And frankly, you see a nice mix between those two when people say that they're Paris aligned. If you look at the Dutch financial sector, the commercial banks, they tend to take a kind of portfolio approach. They say we're Paris aligned because we try and calculate the emissions of our entire portfolio, and we think it's going to be net zero in 2050. In fact, they're also now trying to make claims around we're 1.5 degree, or is it 1.5? That's the next question. When we say Paris aligned, is it 1.5 degree, or is it less than 2 degrees? Is that already good enough? So even there, what temperature goal are we talking about? Next question, which is one that we're grappling with, because we're actually a regulated Dutch bank subject to the Dutch banking agreement, and we're going to have to make our goals at FMO this year and publish them, including interim goals, is how do I make sense of, because we would like to align with 1.5 degrees, of the alignment part. If I've managed to actually calculate my emissions correctly, which is a very big challenge, and you'll have big gaps in your portfolio, which we try and kind of fill in with the joint impact model, for example, so you get modeled emissions where you miss them out. Now I still need to relate them to essentially the carbon budget that we have got left as a world to 1.5 degrees, and how do I do that sensibly? So for Dutch assets, fine. I think we've got a carbon pathway, but how does it work for the rest of our portfolio, which for us, actually operating in emerging markets, is essentially all of it, except our treasury portfolio. And what's a sensible pathway there? If I get to low-income countries, well, I guess in this lovely space, we haven't even actually made very concrete agreements as to what the carbon space is for low-income countries, whereas clearly it would be quite fair if there was a specific carbon budget for them. So even to make concrete sense of a 1.5 degree alignment commitment at an institutional level using the portfolio approach can get quite complicated, and the integrity of those claims, well, I'm going to wish you a lot of luck in assessing whether there is integrity, because you just told me you're going to be doing that for all of us, in fact, and next is FMO. So very much welcome that exercise. Now that's at institutional level, and then of course we've got other approaches, and I think the MDBs have started from that angle, said, well, if we just add up what we're doing in each individual project, and we can have integrity around the fact that we're being Paris aligned in each individual project, surely that should add up also to a credible claim of being Paris aligned. And intellectually I think that also makes a lot of sense, but you get the same kind of questions, right? So I'm doing a deal in DRC and I'm saying I'm Paris aligned. Well, okay, what does it mean? Is the NDC enough? Probably not, but 1.5 degrees, well, I'm still back to the same question as to what's a sensible pathway, and what should DRC be committed to, and how does this particular project now relate to a 1.5 degree alignment? So I think in both approaches you've got these kind of challenges, and we need to clarify. A very different type of point, but I just want to land that as well, is what are we talking about? Are we talking about reporting? No worries. Are we talking about reporting and accountability when we talk about these terms? Take green finance, for example, right? So we want to claim green finance. Well, when we're issuing a sustainability bond, there's some pretty clear definitions out there as to what you can call green, right? And of course the EU is working hard to create some further definition around that. Accountability, very helpful. At the same time, a green label in practice, certainly for our institutions, also has a function in actually driving behavior and functioning as a kind of target setting device. Now, maybe the definitions that you want to use for green for that purpose are different from the ones that you use for reporting. Why? For reporting, we'd like to have kind of ideally dark green, very hard definitions. If you use very hard definitions on the incentivizing and setting targets for staff side, maybe they say, well, I've got this deal that's definitely not dark green, but I could do some real resource efficiency work here. Wouldn't quite meet that hard standard. If it's not going to qualify, why bother, right? Because I'm busy, so I'm not going to do that work now because it doesn't qualify. So a slightly less dark green definition could actually, from a generating change on the ground perspective, be very useful when it's actually a target setting device. So to be sensitive to the purpose of the term that we're using, I think is very important, and not to simply say, well, it's not dark green so it's bad. No, actually in this case it's got a slightly different purpose, so in this case maybe it's actually good to have a more expansive definition or not. Just a few of the things that I wanted to highlight, and then you had a long list. Let me chuck one extra one in for fun, which would be nature positive, which of course with COP15 coming in is going to be very live, and I think that sits nicely at the intersection between climate and biodiversity, because can you be nature positive if you actually have a negative climate impact and a positive biodiversity impact, vice versa? So I think that's going to be a wonderfully complex one that we can spend a lot of time on together, defining in detail.
Yes, those points are all clearly very well made. I think the one you were making about something that's not quite, I'm not going to say dark green, but not quite, let's say, climate, but a good step in the right direction, is kind of coming back to the point about transition finance. Is that transition finance? And is it a good enough step? As that's the whole point about transition finance, right? Transition finance, if you're still in the red area, is not really helping. Then, as I was the rapporteur of the EU platform on sustainable finance that produced the report, I would have to throw another term in, which is amber transition, because the EU platform said we need clarity in what is not green. We need to understand whether it's good enough. And so we actually came up with traffic lights for sustainable finance, where we said if you're moving out of the red into the amber, or you're improving in the amber, we think that is a valid and important transition, because it shines a light on the bit that really needs urgent transition away from, let's say, not being Paris aligned. I bring in another complicated term. So I think you're touching on the same area there, and very much hearing the kind of local question and the budget question. So fantastic points. I'm going to come back to you each again. Having heard what the others have to say, I'm going to sort of just ask you to go round again, see if there's anything that they said that, you know, resonates with you and your organization. So back to you, Sonia. Shorter this time, 2 minutes.
3 thoughts. First of all, another one. What is universally Paris-aligned finance, right? So if I'm not mistaken, and I might be wrong here, and everyone welcome to correct me, at the moment, the MDBs consider all agriculture now, non-ruminant livestock to be universally Paris-aligned. You know, what do everyone think about that? That's, you know, pigs and chickens and that kind of thing. All non-energy intensive manufacturing to be universally Paris-aligned. What does everyone think about that? I also just want to raise the elephant in the room of gas, natural gas investments. I think they are often very much on the cusp, on the borderline in that grey area between what is climate finance, not climate, you know, what is transition finance and so on. And, you know, I think it's really important to address that as 1.5 degrees is slipping away. And then just to confirm that, yes, we will be doing a full Paris alignment assessment on FMO early next year, adding them to our E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix website. And so I look forward to that, and get ready, Jorim.
I think I heard recently from somebody, the high-level climate champions team, that and I may be completely wrong, that GFANS may have published a sort of terminology guide. So I think that could be interesting. Maybe I should have got them here as well. You know, we could have probably had about 50 people, interesting people in the panels, and I'm very glad we've got these people, but we could probably do it all again another day with a totally different set of interesting people to talk about the terminology, because I think that the fact that so many people are working on it is exactly why we need to grapple with these terms. So Morgan, you can try and answer is climate-aligned finance the same thing as Paris-aligned finance, or you can leave that to Barbara if she makes it. I'm hoping she's going to make it in time for the end of the event. But listening to the others, is there anything that you want to add that you've reflected on from the other comments?
Yeah, I'll note I will not try any more definition of climate-aligned finance, except to say that in the Global Landscape of Climate Finance 2021, the very first sort of box anticipating this question is on, I think the title is Climate Finance versus Climate-Aligned Finance. It has a very pretty graphic and describes this in more detail. So one place to look is the Global Landscape of Climate Finance for 2021. So setting that aside, great to hear about the event tomorrow. I'm glad to have teed it up. So I think sort of nothing further on adaptation and resilience finance, except to say that one thing, not so terminology focused, maybe more tracking methodology focused, but that we've been thinking about a lot is what to do with insurance and in terms of tracking. So I don't have a solution here, but I just sort of wanted to flag it as something that we're thinking about a lot in this context, is how to as we track primary investment in the real economy into building climate resilience and tracking that as climate adaptation finance, how too do we think about tracking insurance as a way, as a mechanism to be thinking about the global protection gap. So a little outside of the scope, but just flagging that. And then a final thought, sort of going broader, is just to think about sort of communications and who these, the messaging about terminology is shared with. Just conscious of thinking through in each context, who is the audience, what terms do they need to understand. I think this is a good conversation to have for me to bring back for CPI, so that when we're thinking about climate finance tracking in one context, green finance tracking in another context, we're being super clear about the terminology and why it's being used in the context it's being used. So in some ways, a thank you for pushing this discussion forward, because I think the communications around it and making sure that the audiences are targeted is really critical.
So thank you very much. I think that, Yoram, if you have a chance to give us a perspective of not only what you've heard, but also maybe what you're hearing from, you mentioned pension funds and things like that. Are there any terminology questions coming to you from the private finance world where you think this is a completely different discussion from what's going on in the kind of public bank world? Because maybe we're all, we're MDBs, and then we talk to IDFC, which is great, and then we talk to the ed fees, and then we go to FIX, which is all the public development banks, from around the world. But maybe there's a different terminology discussion going on that you're hearing, I don't know, from sort of the investor side. So over to you anyway for further thoughts.
Let's try again. Yes, working. Yeah, maybe from both sides then, because I was also very triggered by the gas question. I think on the pension side, and it is something that we're also grappling with as FMO, because we intermediate quite a bit of funding across both the public, bilateral, multilateral, and the private sector pension funds, is really the interplay between MDB, green principles, etc., which we like to use as a basis for our definitions to be aligned with our sector, the DFIs. But then also actually the in our case, EU regulatory context, which is really the world of private finance and the pension fund. So EU taxonomy, etc., and finding a way to bridge those two worlds for us is going to be very important, because the pension funds want dark green. So I think that's definitely an element. If you look at where they're at, they want to understand what needs to happen for this to qualify. Also within the new EU regulation and the EU taxonomy definitions that are coming up. So I think that's an important one just to have on the background. And I know that's, for say a World Bank, more difficult to think about when they do their definitions than for the EIB. But it's a large market, so important to keep that in view. And then at the very other end of the spectrum, essentially our clients and the gas question. I think it's important that we don't get stuck only on highly technical definitions, because yes, in Europe, if you're replacing a coal plant, you could, from a very technical perspective, say gas is green. But if you do a smell test, if you will, at the global macro level, right, of that position, it really doesn't sit well, right? From a just transition perspective, surely.
I'm not sure it sits well in the EU. Just speaking as the EU.
It doesn't sit well in the EU either, but
sorry.
It really sits badly with our clients, and we can totally empathize with that, right? From a just transitions and fairness perspective, surely the last cubic meter of gas has to be taken out of the ground, not in Groningen in the Netherlands, where it's causing earthquakes, by the way, but in Africa, and to call it green in the EU, I think is just not helpful. So also there, yes, we can be very technical about our definitions, but to do a kind of macro test of does this still make sense in the bigger scheme of things, and the just transition that we're all looking for, I think is also a test we should put to our technical work.
Yes, and I think if I could just be a bit techie about gas, we tend to talk about gas when really we should be talking about the use of gas. There are some sectors where we have a low carbon solution, power generation, And there are some sectors which use gas where we perhaps at the moment are not quite there yet. And that changes in different countries. So you're right, there has been a development in the EU taxonomy. But my understanding from investors is that they're generally, when they're looking at funds, that's not something that they're hoping to see in a green fund. But that's a discussion for another day, probably in the EU pavilion. So just on the adaptation point, I think some of what you were talking about, how we can really be a bit clearer, will hopefully be answered tomorrow. So I would invite you all to join that. I think it's almost time for us to, it is time for us to move on to the second panel. But you'll get another shot from the floor. So I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind sort of going back to your seats. Dauda, I might need you to go over there. Sorry to do that to you. And and then I'm going to invite the second panel to come up. That's fantastic inputs from all of you. Thank you very much. The second panel, I'm delighted to invite Michael Mullen, who is Program Lead, Climate Adaptation Finance and Investment at OECD, Mathilde Baudelaurent, Head of Climate Change Department at Agence Française de Développement, and Felicity Spores, Head of Sustainable Finance at the Gold Standard Foundation. So this second panel, we're going to try and tackle, it's not a completely different subject. It's obviously the same subject, but maybe from a slightly different angle. We're talking about climate-related financial terminology around not projects, but companies. And some of the other speakers already touched on that. Companies, portfolios. And here we're talking about things like Paris-aligned, low carbon, carbon neutral, net zero, 1.5 degrees aligned, or perhaps the whole temperature goal, which as we know is well below 2 with efforts to reach 1.5, and some people might be using that. That was a very good point that was made by the first panel. What is the temperature goal that you're using? What about a resilient company? So many topics, many terms. Actually, of course, if you want to go back to some of the ones from the first panel, you're welcome. But first turning to, actually, you're sitting in a slightly different order. I'm just going to go in this order because it's easier for me, and it's been a long COP already. So Mathilde, from the point of view of AFD and from what you're hearing, either from outside or inside your organization, what are the terms here which are really confusing or difficult, or where you think that we really need to get to grips and clarify some things? You can use this one, or you... Yes?
Yes, because you've been quite rude with the previous panelists that they had to carry this when you had the nice mic. So I take the nice mic. You should have complained, Sonia. So mine is really net zero. Net zero versus Paris aligned is really, it's something I've been struggling with since I'm in this position as a head for climate and nature. By the way, we're nature positive, Joachim. And nature team within IFD. Of course, there was a defense announcement last year. We all heard that, all the work this year on what is true and net zero. So it has increased the pressure that we have to provide and explain what is our narrative, our commitment, and our results on this part of the agenda. And yet at AFD, the commitment that we have taken is a Paris alignment commitment. And Sonia can witness this Paris alignment commitment has shown to be efficient in shifting, changing the way AFD has been working and in providing results in our daily work. So how come that we are so much challenged with this Paris alignment versus net zero targets? So I just would like to reflect a little bit on this Paris alignment journey for AFD, because I think it's very important. I think also, and this is why I'm so troubled, it's creating a kind of divide in between private banks, which are mainly using the net zero commitments, and most of us, MDBs and PDBs, which are using the Paris alignment process. And we have to talk more about what it is to be Paris aligned. My finance is clean. I can say that. We are out of fossil fuel financing. We have looked at all sectors and have been, for the past years, really working in clarifying what we could or could not do within many sectors, such as you've gone through this hard work as well in many of these banks, and especially you at EIBs. We have embedded those climate-driven priorities and selection criteria and all that. We don't finance fleets or car manufacturers which are beyond the power sector, always the first target of the commercial banks which are working in those net zero strategy. So it's not so easy to say, okay, we pick the most emissive, because then for us the most emissive is agriculture and some hard to abate industrial sector. So not too easy to say what it is to be net zero on those sectors. So this is one. First, we evaluate each and every project. It's a lot of work with an independent second opinion. So we make sure that the governance is really clear and clean on that. On not only climate, not on mitigation and adaptation and resilience, but all the SDGs, because we are a public development bank and we have to make sure that all this is consistent. And third, we support our partner countries in defining their long-term strategies. And behind that, of course, that the idea that our net zero has no importance at all. What is important is the net zero of our partners. So despite all this, how come that it's coming back again and again, and even in Sonia and Laura's assessment of AFD within the benchmark? So I don't say the question is not at all valid. What it brings to me is that we need to think through it, try to see how to be stronger in explaining what it is to be Paris-aligned, try to, from this qualitative process, show quantitative results. So thanks to S3G, we know that they've made the calculation that for us on the power sector, for instance, we invested 23 euro in clean energy for 1 euro in fossil fuel. This is why I can say that my finance is clean. I can answer what is the 1 euro if you want afterwards. So we have to progress on that. But in addition to explain what it is Paris-aligned, I just want to come back again on what also is my trouble on net zero. And notably, so the question of the scope 3 and how complex it is to calculate has been already raised. There's a few other points that I would like to raise. If you take the PCAF approach of it, this is, to me, really dangerous, let's say that. Carbon emissions have materialities. They are going into the atmosphere. They depend on the real life, technical life of the assets you're financing. And they will continue to be emissive even when your loan will be fully reimbursed. So how can we count on an accountability to really assess what are the impacts of our projects in the real world? So that's really, to me, a key point. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I totally understand your concern about having committed to be Paris-aligned, then being asked about net zero. I find myself, as you know, the EIB also committed that it would be Paris-aligned in all its financing activities by the end of 2020, and we were frequently, and still are, confronted by journalist questions about our net zero commitment, which of course we didn't make. We made a different commitment. We didn't make a portfolio commitment. So I think, is that one not working?
Oh. So indeed, I totally appreciate that question, and maybe we need to engage with Sonia and her team on how that's going in their analysis. So without further ado, another wonderful person stepping into the panel. somebody who, it's a public holiday in France, but somebody volunteered OECD for this panel and then found that it was a public holiday in France, so that the whole of OECD is obviously at home with their families, which is fine. But Michael was here at the COP. Michael Mullen, we're very glad that you're here. Of course, the OECD does lots and lots of analysis and produces lots of reports and hosts conferences where people do discuss this. But it's a hard ask, but can you give us some of the top key confusing terms or areas where you think, from OECD point of view, there are the biggest challenges? And you can use this one if you prefer.
Thanks, Nancy. No, it was definitely a surprise to be on this panel, but a pleasant surprise. Instead of diving into the coral reefs like I hoped for, we're diving into methodology, which is even better in some ways. No, but look, I think, this point about the terminology, it's a bit like when you go to the supermarket to buy eggs. And there's all these labels and these things, and, in your mind you're saying, I want a happy chicken. I want this to be produced in some kind of a reasonable standard. And there's 15 different labels, 14 of which mean nothing. So I think, part of this proliferation, and let's be blunt about it, is a desire for greenwashing. It's a desire to say, we're doing lots of things without incurring the costs or the effort of actually doing it. So I haven't consulted with any of my colleagues because I only found out this morning, so these are just like my opinions. But I think also, to be fair, it is hard. It's methodologically hard. And the thing that I'd like to focus on is the kind of systematic neglect of adaptation when talking about Paris alignment, when talking about transition, et cetera, et cetera. And so, if you look at the Paris Agreement, you look at Article 2.1c, it quite clearly says, climate resilient development. It's there. With the MDB methodologies, it's there. But if you look at the private sector discussion, it is completely absent. And I think that is a huge gap, because if we only talk about adaptation as in money that's being spent with a deliberate intent to adapt to climate change, we have a tiny part of the picture. We really need to consider to what extent are broader capital flows conducive to the goal of building resilience to the impacts of climate change. So me and Nicola Ranger from Oxford actually wrote a methodology paper, conceptual paper on this, which kind of dives into it in more detail. The second point is on transition finance. Okay, so this is great, we recognize not everyone is where they need to be immediately. Is this consistent with the transition we need to net zero? Fine. But also, the physical climate we're in is changing. We already see it. And so, when we talk about transition finance, I think we should also be talking about, does this finance make sense? Is it conducive to building resilience, given the transition in the physical climate risks that we face? Thank you.
So I totally agree with you, and I think that hopefully you're well aware of the MDB adaptation event tomorrow. I suspect you probably are. Are you on the panel? No? Oh, okay. But anyway. So, but anyway, I'm sure you'll be there and probably asking us some challenging questions from the floor. Indeed, the question of the other goals other than mitigation is critical, and I actually also joined a number of discussions where people say, oh yeah, well at the moment we're only looking at mitigation, and I understand that, but at what point do we remember to look at adaptation, and then biodiversity, and then circular economy, and then maybe pollution? It is hard because it widens it much further out. But if we don't, we're somehow missing some of the most important things. So thank you for reminding us about that. I'm going to pass on to Felicity. Do you want to use the oh, you've got the good microphone. That's all right. So Felicity, delighted to have you here from the Gold Standard Foundation. So from from that side and all what you're hearing, what would be your key issues around terminology, challenges, etc.? Please give us whatever insights or whatever terms bother you the most.
There's quite a lot of terms that bother me, but I want to go back to Paris alignment and net zero, because gold standard is an impact management standard. Okay, sorry, is that better? We're an impact management standard. And so from this approach, we're looking at impact. What is that? It is not an ESG. It is not risk avoidance. It is an actual measurement at the project level, so under the company, the project level, of an outcome, a positive change in our real economy. Now, ESG measures at the level of corporate, and that's where most finance investment flows are looking. They invest in a corporate that does the projects. So for me, when you talk about Paris alignment, it makes sense for MDBs. Why? Because MDBs have a mandate to invest in activities as well as companies to support the objectives of Paris, which is hopefully 1.5, but at least better than 2, right? So with that in mind, that's very different from a corporate who is primarily looking at his projects, where to me, net zero makes sense to a corporate. Why? I think journalists are a bit confused, but net zero forces corporates, in my view, to think about impact. It means that they have to measure and attribute what they're doing. If we could align Paris aligned, the problem we have from an accounting perspective with Paris aligned is we don't know how to attribute the enabling activities, these other activities that are not just the financial flow into what the company's doing to drive an action, but actually the investment in the enabling environment or the investment in technical assistance to do feasibility studies, these additional activities, which is an MDB mandate. It's very hard to attribute how that comes into a measurable impact claim. And that we've got to crack it. So my question to all of us here is, could we try and crack the attribution? And that could be very simple. It could be very pragmatic. It doesn't always have to be a mathematical formula, but I think that's quite important. The other thing I really don't like is carbon neutral. Carbon neutral. I'm carbon neutral. Enron came out and said we're carbon neutral, and they're offsetting. And as a standard that has a big role in the voluntary carbon markets, I think we should just get rid of that term altogether, because it's got no pathway. And we've spoken about transition. That's really important. And to the point about adaptation, a point to be very clear about is adaptation is about risk, but risk is measured with no data, because we don't have it. So we have a very different problem there. So we have to get real about public consultation. Otherwise, we're only going to be doing risk management for infrastructure. And actually, where adaptation matters the most is in the areas where they're doing agriculture. So just a kind of little flag, as we were talking about it, and to plug, because I've got the microphone, our new adaptation requirements, which are trying to fill that gap. Have a look at our website, hint, hint.
But I'm actually secretly an adaptation person, so I can only 100% agree with you. And in fact, I think you mentioned agriculture. One of the challenges, and the MDBs are trying to address it in their intermediated finance, is how to build the climate resilience of SMEs, which we usually finance through intermediary banks. It's not that obvious how you do that. And we're talking there about very small companies who you talked about data. They're unlikely to have a person who could even go and look at the data if there was some data, because they're busy running their small business. So there's many areas where the MDBs and other IFIs are trying hard to think how to overcome those problems. You mentioned another one, and I think that's very, very valid. So I'm going to go back round the table again. So Michael, can you hand that back to Mathilde? So from what you've heard, but also from what you heard in the first panel, anything you want to add, a couple of minutes on any other thing that's come into your mind while you've been listening? So Mathilde.
I think if I start on the nature positive, we will not end the session. So I will I will just want to react and to add up on the transition finance part, which is really for sure the next struggle or difficulties where we really need to progress rapidly on what it could mean, because it has to mean something and to be clarified urgently. I said my financing is clean. It's easy. I'm a small DFI. Let's be fair with you. It's much complex for the World Bank with the mandate they have and so on. Okay, I want to be fair like that. But for instance, when I'm working with a huge power utility in an emerging market which has committed to be net zero, and I want to support them in their transition. If I support their corporate plan to transit away from coal, maybe with new gas assets within their transition, my portfolio will be less clean. And still, I have much more impact in the long-term emission of the planet if I do this loan, a corporate loan. So I want to do it, but I want to do it with being completely transparent on what it means and why I do it. I cannot qualify it as easily as climate finance as I did over the past, because what is so good in the way we did define climate finance is that we've been quite stringent. I want to be able to report separately on this type of funding, and I think it's really urgent, and we haven't really started working on it.
I think that we're all grappling with that. I mean, I think the danger with transition finance, however you define it, is that at some point you have to define the stuff that's not good enough, not ambitious enough, or not urgent enough in that particular place, in that particular sector, to be counted as going in the right direction adequately. You know, and an obvious one is energy efficiency in a thermal coal plant. You know, I mean, that's something that the MDBs would have counted way back when. And I think that brings in the question of how fast the science is changing. So whatever definition or approach we use, we have to have this regular review, because what might have been good enough 2 years ago may be completely inadequate now. And that's the reality of the world that we live in, because humanity has left it like 20, 30 years too late to take serious action that can be done without those kind of very urgent and ambitious efforts. So you know, that's a really big challenge, and I think, leaving aside the terminology, that probably is another topic for further work. But now coming to you, Michael, anything else that's popped into your head, or anything you've remembered, or from the first panel or the second panel that you want to add?
Actually, just a quick reflection, which is, in the first panel, there's a mention about adaptation-aligned finance and whether that's better than resilience-aligned finance. I'd probably take the opposite view, actually, because I think if you look at you know, adaptation as a what's the word, active process of we are adapting to climate change as a policy agenda, you're only picking up a small fraction of what you actually want to pick up. You know, that's why in our paper, and apologies for this, we called it climate resilience aligned finance. And the point of that was not just to make up new terms, but it was because it puts the focus on the outcome. And the words we use shape the mental models that we apply to these problems. And I think it's important to focus on, okay, ultimately, what do we need to achieve? And is this consistent with it, rather than getting too hung up on the process? Thank you.
So, yep, thank you. Very, very important. And this is Decarbonisation Day, but decarbonisation that's not resilient is a waste of time. So always good to have you here to remind us about the second objective in the EU taxonomy. The other half of climate finance, or whatever you want to call it, is very important. Felicity.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to stay on that theme because I don't think we can say it enough. But okay, on the adaptation side, I think adaptation again is relevant to companies and project activities that are investing in income-generating technology solutions. They talk about adaptation because they're providing a solution, a practice. But we really need the MDBs and the people with responsibility for society to really focus on the resilience story. Why? If you just have a technical solution, you're not going to be able to, you have people who won't buy it. We see farmers who can't buy the solution. So resilience to me is a slightly different definition than was said earlier, which is really the integrated approach to making sure that the adaptive technology or approach or method is actually doable, and that's where MDBs with and this Paris alignment focus, which talks about investments in companies and other activities, is so critical. So, Paris alignment actually does include adaptation and mitigation, And I'm proud to say that we're driving impact at Gold Standard because we bring in adaptation and mitigation in what's commonly seen as a carbon standard. So I hope we'll support what you're doing too.
Yes. So something I said, in fact, at the MDB event on Paris alignment, I'm just going to repeat for those of you that weren't there. The MDBs considered combining building block 1 on mitigation goal and building block 2 on the adaptation goal in their Paris alignment framework, and we decided not to do that because adaptation will always then somehow get forgotten or left till later. So we decided to keep them separate in order to show how important they both are. So thank you very much for reminding us about that. I'm actually just going to, we're a little bit ahead of time, so I'm going to open the floor to either the panelists from panel 1 or from anybody else in the audience who wants to, I don't think we're questioning. I'd like to hear from any of you with any terminology that we didn't tackle yet, or any really confusing term in around climate and Paris aligned carbon neutral. So if you want to add something, you know, please put your hand up and we'll get the microphone to you. Lorenzo, can you, sorry. Get that panelist back. No.
Hello, thank you so much. My name's Fran Witt from Recourse. It's been a really interesting discussion and I think really helpful in exploring some of the difficulties in these definitions. I was really glad to hear the issue of gas being touched upon earlier, and I think you mentioned that it was the elephant in the room, but I really think that it should be no longer the elephant in the room. It needs to be openly discussed and constantly addressed, because I think that for Paris alignment to be real, it needs to exclude the expansion and support for fossil gas and for LNG, particularly in some of the countries where we have partners. I'm thinking about, for example, Vietnam, where at the moment there is no operational LNG, and yet there are massive plans for expansion of that, with support from at least the IFC and other development banks. So I'd really like to start to see that conversation on gas being explored much more openly as part of Paris alignment.
I think that's a very, very important point. I think it touches on what several panelists talked about, needing to be clearer what transition finance is and what it isn't. So thank you for that point. So anybody else who want? Yes, so Ian. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Great, thank you everyone. So Ian Cochrane from University of Edinburgh, but probably I want to thank the panelists obviously for the insights, and it was good to see, and I'm sorry to plug a paper that I was an author on, but it's also good to see that the paper that Alice and I developed back in 2019 on this issue of Paris alignment still remains relevant, because I think in my mind a lot of what we're talking about, and again I'm not saying this because I made the paper and we wrote they made the diagram, but is on that kind of bullseye approach, which is maybe the element I wanted to bring into this conversation, particularly when we talk about the difference between climate-aligned and Paris-aligned finance. Because climate-aligned can maybe be everything technically that's aligned with what contributes to climate goals, whereas Paris-aligned introduces an element, or at least we thought back in 2019, and I still think today, an element of ambition into the conversation, where the Paris Agreement is built on this idea of building and developing ambition. And so we proposed that kind of bullseye with at the center what I think maybe some of you have said is dark green, and that was the color we used in the bullseye, but the term we used was transformational. And that's actually a term I don't think we've used yet today in the conversation, and another term that we're seeing a little bit everywhere, but particularly when we're talking about public funds and public capital and maybe impact capital, if we do want to expand it out to the commercial markets, is really important, because it's about what piece of all what we're doing is really more than the sum of its parts. It's not just the money going into a project or supporting a company, but really expanding that out and having spillover effects and impacts, and trying to be ambitious in the scale of the impact. And I'm sorry for the squeaking on the microphone. So I'd be interested in hearing everybody's thoughts on transformational. It's an area that I think more work needs to be done, because I've probably heard that term used about 50 different ways in the last 5 days. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
I think, hello. I think if I remember the meeting where you showed us the bullseye, I think coming back to Mathilde's point, we didn't disagree that maybe transformational was very important. I think we just said that it might not always be in the middle of the bullseye. You could have something that's transformational in changing a very high emitting activity. You might not call it green, but that might be in its own way transformational. So I think that was, but I agree with you, again, it's another term, transformational finance, and you mentioned impact finance, which we hadn't even touched on, so that's a bit like nature positive. Yes, we could have another meeting, except that I think that the room is booked. So anybody else? Any other hands up? Yes, Carol.
I see 3 hands. Oh, sorry, yeah, well, of course, for me, I would say a terminology that is quite challenging is the terminology just transition. Again, a word of transition. We see quite different interpretations of that from a very narrow perspective about closing down a coal power plant and what do we do with the people that get unemployed, up to basically social injustice as a result, for instance, that certain groups are more affected by climate change than others, or that certain climate policies will affect or will benefit from only certain type of people and not others. So that's for me an important discussion as well, and especially also the point that you raised. Just transition, sometimes people just consider it only for mitigation, while others also see it's the adaptation part, is that part of that discussion as well. So for me, I would like to bring this in.
I actually deliberately wasn't mentioning it because I thought I'm going to just open another whole book, but absolutely spot on. So no, we're not going to do nature positive, I don't think. There are 2 more people, I think, that would like to speak, and then we'll have to start wrapping up because we've got another MDB here to make some closing remarks. So, please.
Alice Potier from I4CE, Institute for Climate Economics. I think on our end, we are also very much struggling with the fact that to be Paris aligned, there's also need to contextualize also these climate finance definitions. So to be very much Paris aligned, there is a need, of course, to make sure that your project operations counterparties are aligned with international climate goals, but also with national pathways towards achieving these goals. This is also something that a number of NDCs as well are not ambitious enough today. So another complex issues.
If that is Helena Fiestas, and I think it is, Carol, can you go and grab her and tell her to come into this meeting? Because she's in the UN high-level, I'm going to say it wrong, high-level group that's about clear net zero commitments, isn't it? Whatever it was, she was standing next to the... Anyway. So I'm now going to try.
One last word.
There's one last. Oh, sorry. There's one last question. Yes.
One word we don't. Arno from Proparco, the private sector arm of Group AFD, about enforcement and monitoring, because we talked a lot about ambition, pledges, stated policies. If you look at traffic law in France, all the cars in Paris should drive at 30 kilometers per hour. It should be 80 kilometers per hour on French roads. Cars don't drive at this speed, and we talk a lot about all these commitments that are made. But if there's no enforcement, how can we be sure that these goals are going to be met? And so, there's one elephant that's not in the room yet. Where's the green police?
I think that comes back very much to the transparency, but you're adding accountability, and that. You know, we have an entity here who absolutely would agree with you. So I think you're absolutely right, and I actually think that it's in a way an area where we as public banks can show the way. I'm personally quite outraged about companies producing glossy reports which talk about low carbon LNG. it's not low carbon, but you know, presumably their lawyers thought that was okay. But the one way we can show the way is by having a second opinion. You mentioned that, Mathilde, a second opinion, external scrutiny, in our case, external auditing, and kind of show this is what you need to do if you're going to be credible. You know, a picture of a tree on the front of your report is not going to save the planet, right? So if you're going to make claims, have them. I don't know that I want green police, but I absolutely think that you're touching on another very, very important point. So thank you very much, everybody that's contributed. I'm going to try and wrap up very quickly. I think one of the things I picked up was several of you are concerned about one or two terms that do create the opportunity for greenwashing or transition washing, which is, you know, a particular new type of greenwashing. And I think that we also need to grapple with that, because in a way it's like also focusing on only on what needs to happen in developing countries, which is incredibly important. But one of the most important thing is for the existing emitters to massively decarbonize. This is Decarbonization Day, to massively step up and deliver not only on their commitments to developing countries, which is very important, but on decarbonizing themselves. That would be like a very important thing to do. And while all that is hidden behind possibly smoke and mirrors of terminology or terms that perhaps don't really mean anything scientifically, or offsetting everything like carbon neutral, that, you know, that we're not going to have that focus, this desperately important focus that we need in this critical decade. So I would suggest that those particular terms, we need to ourselves really try to be as transparent as possible and not use them, or when we use a term, be extremely clear what we mean. And I think as the chair of the MDB reporting group, I'll be trying to take some of that forward into our reporting, because I think we can lead the way, and as do you all and the first panel, on being super clear about what is good enough, what is Paris aligned, what is climate finance, what is just transition. Indeed, there is going to be an MDB event on just transition. The last thing I want to say in wrapping up is, regardless of what we call it and what color green we think it is, so there's Joram, it is essential that we understand that simply having everything Paris aligned is not enough at this point. You need things to be Paris aligned, but you still need that relentless focus on the things that are going to help fix the problem. So however the portfolio approach goes, or however the commitments by, whether it's a company or a public entity or an MDB or an IFI, it needs to have those two elements. Focus on things that really help solve the problem, and making sure that you're not still creating the problem. And I think as long as you've got those two parts, you may have different ways of doing it, but that's absolutely critical. And I think that shareholders are entitled to know how you're doing both. What is it you're doing when you say your green, your climate target? What is it you're doing when you say you're Paris aligned, you're net zero, you're low carbon, you're whatever you are? And both sides, you need to be super transparent. And I would agree with you, you need probably to consider having some second opinion or some kind of scrutiny of it to help drive that into the rest of the market. Because otherwise, I mean, we don't have time for another 5 years of, what is it that Greta called it, net zero, blah, blah, blah. We don't have time. You know, that's the reality of it. I wish it wasn't true, but that's where we are. I think it's been absolutely fantastic to hear from you all. I'd like to now invite Daouda Ndaye, who's the lead climate change expert at Islamic Development Bank, to come up and give us some closing remarks. Actually, Daouda has been co-chairing the adaptation working groups. That's another shout out to the event for tomorrow. Please come along to that, and please look at the program of all the other MDB events, which are going on all day here, and the joint events are always at 1 o'clock, and then the other MDBs have also other events. So Daouda, please come up. Where's the microphone gone?
one works. Okay, thank you. Was a very interesting discussion. I would say whoever is coming up with all these definitions, please bring the methodologies, the reporting requirement with it, all of it at once, so that it will make our life easier. So on a serious note, I think the whole discussion here is showing how this is a dynamic, this is a process in terms of improving our systems as public development banks, as private sector, all of it looking at the same overarching objective, right, of addressing the Paris Agreement, but also looking at our environment and sustainable activities as a whole. And with that objective, we come up with all these different types of definitions within these two overarching goals that we're trying to achieve. And you look at the example of a car, the Citroën that you used to have in 1930 or 1940 running was a car, and the Tesla is a car right now. And both of them were trying to achieve to just go through the road and take us from here to there. I would take the journey that we're having as institutions that way. We have studied, for example, I would take the MDB Paris Alignment Framework. We know that in a few years it will be more sophisticated, it will have more stronger reporting systems. It will include all these aspects, you know, that we're mentioning. How do we define net zero? How do we have harmonized systems? How do we have GHG accounting systems that are running? Some MDBs have it, others are working on it, etc. So I think it's a journey. It's a journey which is not an easy one. Of course, we will always have E3G, CPI, you know, coming up with some red and gray and green and orange boxes. But for us, working on these internal aspects, we know that it's not an easy task, and it's a journey. We have these very ambitious targets. We know about the urgency to act, but I think it's a dynamic process. You have to start somewhere. You have to start with a Citroën, and then it proves, you know, you have the technology, you have the new systems, you have the new methodologies within the institutions, and also this helps as you go to trickling it down to the private sector company you're working with the countries you're working with, to help them as well improve their systems. So I think the way we are having all these definitions, you have on the top of it Paris Aligned, ESG, and then you get down to climate aligned, and then you get down to nature, positive, etc., etc. All of these aspects within our institutions, we are ticking the boxes as we go, one after another. Of course, we discuss here harmonization. Let's try to remove some of the definitions that do not go together, do not make sense, so that it will also clarify the whole process. And like I said, reporting methodology, that's the hard part of it, and we know it. And it's easy to come up with the definitions, but then how to make it work in reality, it's a very difficult business. So I think it was a very good conversation. Thank you everyone.
So thank you everybody, Thank you everybody who's joined us online. Thank you to those of you here in the pavilion. Thank you, Daouda, for those very wise words. thank you to all the panelists, and see you at the next MDB event or in another pavilion. Thank you.
Thanks.